Okay, we should be recording, so let me get going right away, if I can. Okay, where did this go? Maybe I've already got it in PowerPoint. There we go. So the digestive system is a very interesting system, and it's extremely important because even though it's weird to think about, we're actually a complete community of cells that have to have what they need in order to perform the functions that they perform. And in order to get the nutrients and what they need, we have to eat. And the digestive system has to break down what we eat into small enough units that the cells can actually interact with them. And remember, a cell's a microscopic thing, so things have got to be broken down very, very teeny tiny into the molecular level in order for us to eat this. Now, one of my favorite things, or one of the things that tells me the digestive system is extremely important, I mean all of our systems are important obviously, is that we have, I'm going to go back to that one, we have lots and lots of our nervous system that is dedicated to our gut. And there are more neurons that go to our digestive system than come out of our entire spinal column. So that's pretty impressive. Also, at least 70% of our immune system is tied up with the digestive system because we cannot eat food that is sterile. If you sterilized your food with a blowtorch, you wouldn't be left with anything. And even if you cook the food, you've got to cool it off a little bit before you eat it, and something in the environment is going to fall on it, right? And there are some real advantages to eating some of your food raw because sometimes heat destroys nutrients that we need. On the other hand, sometimes when you cook things, it releases some nutrients so that you can absorb them better, so it just depends. I'm thinking like tomato is an example of when you cook it, there are nutrients that are released that you can absorb better, whereas cooking some other things doesn't work that way. Okay, another thing I want to tell you just right up front, because a lot of my students miss this extremely important point about the digestive system, and this is that the small intestine is something we can't do without. We can do without part of it, but we can't do without most of it, because this is where in our body that we absorb most of our nutrients. And it's also where we absorb most of our water. A lot of people think we absorb most of our water in the large intestine or colon, but we don't. We do take out some more of it so that we don't have watery, diarrhea-y kind of stools, but most of the water that we get comes from the small intestine. So without this part of our digestive system, we are really in a heap of trouble. You might know of people that have had like stomach cancer and have had their stomach removed, you might know of people that have had part of their stomach moved to control their weight. You might know of people that have colonoscopies, colostomies, and so they can live without part of their large intestine, but the small intestine not so much. Now, right here at this slide, let me get down a few terms. First of all, do you know the difference between a macro and a micronutrient? That's right, macro is big. And what it means, it doesn't mean that the nutrient is actually big. Well, it kind of is to start with, I guess. But it means that we need these nutrients in pretty large amounts in our body. And the three things that we have to have in pretty large amounts to make it are proteins. You might know that some of the proteins are actually essential. Did you know that? And that means that our bodies can't make them. The liver makes all sorts of interesting proteins for us. You might remember that it makes a lot of our plasma proteins. The liver is also able to make it's able to make our cholesterol. So the liver is able to make a lot of things. Our body's able to make a lot of things, but there are things that our body doesn't make, and those things are called essential, and there are some essential, what they call amino acids. So that's our first type of macronutrient. The second type of macronutrient we have are called lipids or fats. And a lot of folks think that, that there are a lot of folks that eat a very low-fat diet, which is okay, but there are also some fatty acids that are essential. So we have to have some fat in our diet. And then there are folks that eat a very low-carb diet, and there are some real advantages to that, but the thing about carbohydrates is that our body has to have them. The brain burns straight carbohydrate. If you don't have carbohydrate, then the liver is going to convert your proteins and your fats and everything else so that we have carbohydrates to burn. Does that make sense? All right. And obviously we have to have a good bit of water. We're very water-based. I'll probably tell you this again, but just a very good rule of thumb, as they say, about whether or not you've gotten the water you need. And obviously various things color urine. I'm thinking of beets and vitamins, but anyhow, and UTI medicine also discolors urine. But if you wake up in the morning and your urine looks like apple juice, that means you need to drink more water. You're not very well hydrated. And oftentimes, older people in particular are very susceptible to being dehydrated and not realizing it, and it can cause a lot of issues. They think that contributed to my uncle's stroke. They think that being dehydrated contributed to a stroke. How would that work anyway? How could you have not a heart attack, a stroke, because you're dehydrated? Well, what the heck would be going on with that?
Blood gets thicker.
That's right. Your blood gets thicker because you wouldn't have as much water in your blood, and that makes it more susceptible to clotting. And so you just don't know how important it is to drink water. All right. That's enough about this. I've talked about this slide long enough. So let me move on. And there's also a name given, and you can read it more. I'm not going to just cover it a whole lot, but I want you to be aware of it. There is something that your book talks about in more detail than I will, and it's called the enteric nervous system, commonly known as the gut brain. And it refers to all these different neurological parts of the digestive system that are controlled by the autonomic, internally and by the autonomic nervous system. And it's over 10 million different neurons. And the real name, like I said, for the gut brain is the enteric nervous system. Now, do you guys know this term, enteric? Sometimes you take medicine that's enteric coated. What does that mean? Why would you coat a medicine anyway? That's right. It doesn't get digested as fast. That's very well said. Or it's coated so it doesn't immediately dissolve. It waits until it gets where it needs to be to dissolve. So, for example, you wouldn't burn up your stomach or your esophagus or that kind of thing. So enteric refers to the GI tract. So when you see that combining form, that's just another. If you see something enteric, it's going to have to do with the GI tract, which stands for, by the way, gastrointestinal tract. I'll try a pen today. Maybe they got it fixed while I was away. Is that being completely optimistic? What do you think? Well, now I can't find it at all. I'm a little worried. Did that make Tegrity stop? Oh well, if it did, I'll record in my next one and post it. But anyhow, GI stands for gastrointestinal. I will write it in for you guys. You will not be able to see this if you look at it later. But it's G. Well, never mind. The pen's not going to write no matter which. But G-A-S-T-R-O, which means stomach, and then intestinal, I-N-S-T-S-T-I-N-A-L. And they just call it the GI tract for short. And sometimes you'll see the name alimentary canal instead of GI tract. They're the same thing. I've listed the parts here. The food goes from your mouth to your throat, which is your pharynx, down the pipe called the esophagus. You can't feel it because it's behind your trachea. And then that esophagus pierces the diaphragm and dumps the food into the stomach. The stomach is interesting, and it has an extra layer of muscle, and it churns your food up. And then it leaves the stomach and it goes into the small intestine, where most of your digestion is going to occur. The small intestine is called small intestine because it's much smaller diameter than the large intestine, but it's extremely long. You could dangle it out the window and it'd definitely hit the parking lot, all right, if you took somebody's and strung it out there. So very, very long. You need lots of space for this to happen. And then finally, from the small intestine, it goes into the large intestine, which is also known as the colon. And so those are your basic parts of the alimentary canal. Everything else is considered to be an accessory digestive organ. And accessory digestive organs in the mouth include your tongue and your teeth, and then the salivary glands. Saliva is extremely important, believe it or not, as are your tongue and teeth. Without your teeth, you tend to be nutritionally in trouble, because in order to get the nutrition you need to chew. Nowadays they have some supplemental kind of things like Ensure is kind of a name brand most people know that are for folks that have compromised ability to chew or eat properly. And then the tongue mixes the food up for us. The salivary glands moisten the food and do all other sorts of things that we'll be talking about. They actually have some digestive enzymes in there. The liver does a gazillion different things for us, and it's one of its big digestive things it does is it makes a substance called bile. And then the gallbladder, to me, is like the storage locker or kind of servant of the liver. It basically stores that bile that's made by the liver. A lot of students get very mixed up and think the gallbladder makes bile, but it does not. That's why you can live without one, because you can't live without really making bile. Without that, you can't absorb those fats that I talked about earlier. And then finally, you have the pancreas. And the pancreas is a relatively small organ. The liver's tremendous. And the pancreas you can't live without because it makes so many of our enzymes. And remember, to break down any of those nutrients, you've got to have enzymes. You might remember too from your studies of enzymes, enzymes are extremely specific. So if you have an enzyme that breaks down only starch and you pour it on a piece of meat, it won't do anything to it. If you, on the other hand, have an enzyme that's specific for breaking down certain amino acids chains and you put it on a piece of bread, it might make it soggy, but it's not going to break it down. Does that make sense? Okay. So anyhow, these are accessory organs. Here's the picture from your textbook that shows some of these. Here's some of the salivary glands. I think you probably recognize everything else. They usually, the gallbladder does, even in the cadaver picture in your book, it does have kind of a greenish tint because that substance I told you it's stored is a greenish kind of pigment in there. The bile is kind of a greeny, yellowy, ooky looking stuff. Here's that pancreas. You can see it's kind of stuck right here where the small intestines start. The small intestines are in this area, centrally located. Again, you're not going to be able to see me point unless I can find my other tools, which is my computer aid. But anyhow, centrally located. I guess I can walk over here and point, and then maybe you can see it here. And then what the kind of the large intestine frames it. The appendix is considered part of the large intestine, and basically the food goes in to the large intestine, has to be pushed up against gravity, then it has to go across, then it has to come down, and then finally out this way. There's some folks that really think it's very important that you, well, obviously very important that you eat enough fiber so that the food can be pushed this way and this way. And there's some experts that think sometimes if you're not eating properly, that things build up in here and can cause this part to sag, which kind of makes sense. Interesting. All right, so your book starts out talking about the digestive processes. And the digestive processes, you have to get the food in. That's called ingestion. In normal folks, that's with your mouth. Okay. Now there are people that have to be fed with tubes, either directly into their stomach, or sometimes they'll put it down all the way through. It's one of those things in your health directive you need to put in whether you want that done to you or not in certain circumstances. Now I know one stroke victim that had to be fed with a tube going into their stomach for a couple of months, and then they were recovered enough that they could eat again. Sometimes that happens, sometimes not. Then the food has got to be propulsed, if you will. It's got to be pushed around. You've got to get it from the mouth all the way down to where it comes out, the anus. So that's propulsion. Anything moving food around is propulsion, whether it's mixing it up or moving it back and forth or that kind of thing, even swallowing. And then there is this concept of mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. And I always think of mechanical digestion being anything a blender can do to food. So if you take broccoli or whatever and you put it in a blender, and you have a really nice blender, let's say, and you leave it in there and you come back, you can put a little water in if you want to, but let's just say we put some water and we put some broccoli in a blender and we leave it on for a while and we come back, what do we have? Little teeny tiny pieces of broccoli. You can still see that they're broccoli. Probably still taste like broccoli, right? It's just really small. But chemical digestion is an entirely different thing. With chemical digestion, we're breaking apart the components of that broccoli so that we break it apart so that we can extract the vitamins and the starch and the various parts of that broccoli. So we wouldn't recognize it as broccoli anymore at all. Then we have to absorb the food. That means we got to get it from that alimentary or GI canal. We've got to get it into our actual, I'm trying to get this so you can see me, so that we got to get it from the GI tract into the body. And the GI tract is actually considered to be outside of our body since we're arranged in a tube around a tube. But anyhow, I don't know, if I had worms in my intestinal tract, I don't really think I would think of them as being outside of my body. But anyhow, technically they're supposed to be outside of the body. And then you got to get rid of the leftovers, and that's defecation. All right, here's a picture from your textbook you might want to look at, 23-2. I don't love it. It's a little too complicated, but it does summarize everything and include everything, all the different parts. So it's not bad, so I included it. All right, so I have definitions here. I've already talked about what ingestion is. I've already talked about what propulsion is, but here's a new word, peristalsis. Oh, by the way, that's on the test. I remember that. What is peristalsis? These are waves of contraction that move the food through our actual GI tract, or any hollow organ for that matter. And so basically, the way the gut's made is we've got muscles that are arranged this way and muscles that are arranged this way, and they basically kind of take turns contracting, and they push the food through, or back and forth, which is a special case I'll talk about in just a minute. So these are waves of muscle contraction that are moving the food, pushing the food along through the GI tract, performed by our smooth muscles. So what else did I want to say? Mechanical digestion, that's chewing your food, mixing your food, churning the food. And if you have any problems, there are fabulous interactive physiology things on this through mastering. So take a look, see if you have any problems. Now, I've talked about peristalsis, which is basically pushing the food through, say from the esophagus to the stomach to the small intestine, or that kind of thing. But there's also something called segmentation. And segmentation is always described as, or not always, but often described as kind of a massaging of the food. And where this happens is in particularly the small intestine, where it's very important that the food is exposed to all the enzymes that are going to be in there, so that they can get broken down, and also so that the food is exposed to the surface of the small intestine that has these little finger-like villi, so that the food can be absorbed. And so at that point, the food kind of goes back and forth and back and forth, and this picture B is supposed to be kind of showing you how that gets all mixed up.
And peristalsis and segmentation are both mechanical.
That's right. They would both be considered mechanical processes. Yep. Another definition of chemical digestion, and you do have a definition of either chemical or mechanical digestion on your test. I can't remember which one, or the old test I looked at. And another definition of this is the catabolic breakdown of food. You might remember that catabolism is breaking stuff down, whereas anabolism is building things back up. Do you remember that? Whereas metabolism is just all the different chemical processes that happen. And then there's absorption. Again, this is when we take the nutrients and we take them out of the GI tract and we move them into either the bloodstream, or you might remember those lacteals of the lymphatic system that absorb the fat. And then finally, defecation is getting rid of anything we can't get rid of. Our bodies actually are pretty effective at absorbing what they can in food, but there's some things we just can't digest. Hair is something we can't digest. Certain fibers we can't digest. It's not that the fiber, I'm not talking about hair fiber, I'm talking about like fibrous material in plants that we eat in particular. Some are soluble, some are not soluble, but they're very important in helping our intestines, if you will, get a grip on things so that the food can move along. And there are other important components to eating fiber. One thing about more fibrous materials, if you eat, say, for example, a piece of brown well, not necessarily colored brown, but a whole grain bread versus a white piece of bread that has the grain removed is it doesn't make your blood sugar spike as quickly. And we now know that blood sugar spikes, even in folks without diabetes, are damaging. So keeping your blood sugar steady is important for everybody, whether you have diabetes or not. Anyhow. Now, there are all sorts of things that are regulating the GI tract, like I said, a million different nerves, but I did want to point out that there are also your book talks about mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors. The only real mechanoreceptor I know about, or that they've given as an example in the text, is the stretch receptors. And basically, they're receptors that can tell that when you've eaten and your stomach expands, or when the food moves from your stomach to the intestine and the intestine expands. And there are receptors that are picking up on that. And so it's another clue that something needs to be done. For example, when your stomach gets distended, it might be time to put in enzymes into the stomach, right? So, and the stomach needs to churn up the food when the food's in there. And then when the intestine starts expanding, then intestinal fluids need to be released into the intestine. Chemoreceptors are all along the way. They pick up on osmolarity. They pick up on whether or not the food is still just a big old hunk of meat, or in other words, a substrate, or whether you've broken it down into end products like amino acids. And then there are pH receptors. And you might remember, or you might not remember from your 103 or freshman biology class, enzymes are very specific in that they only work on one thing. But they're also very, very picky about pH. And if they're put in the wrong pH, they don't work very well. And enzymes are just little proteins, but proteins are very picky about what environment they like. And so if you change the pH up too much, from what they like, they're not going to work properly. Your book talks too about how there are different reflexes that are going to be initiated based on what information comes in from these receptors. So, and I think I've given these examples. They can cause you to release stuff or not release stuff. They can cause you to mix food up or move it along. So anything like that. Now, I've also talked, like I said, about the enteric nervous system or gut brain. Your book talks about short and long reflexes. I don't usually ask about this on the test at all. I do think it's interesting, but if you want really a lot more information on the enteric nervous system, I think you're going to have to go online. But mainly my goal is to just have you know what the enteric nervous system is. Now, also, we're going to see that there are lots of hormones that are going to get involved in the whole process of digestion. Even though we've got a million nerves that are dedicated to it, you might remember that we have two different systems that control things in our body: the endocrine system, which are anything that releases hormones, and the nervous system. And in your book, in this chapter, there is an entire table that lists different hormones that are involved with digestion. I'm going to pick a few key ones that I want you to really hammer on and know about, but it's interesting to see. I think it's very interesting that most of the serotonin that we make is made by the GI tract. Did you guys know that? And then a lot of people have problems with serotonin in their brains, and most of our, well, not all most, but there's an entire group of drugs that people take for depression called serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Have you guys heard of those? And but interestingly enough, the serotonin that comes from the gut doesn't interfere with the brain because of that. Do you remember studying that blood-brain barrier? So anything from lower down doesn't go in. But anyhow, I think it's interesting. So I think you'll be amazed at different hormones that are controlling GI tract as well. Now, another thing that we're going to really see when we do this dissection that's coming up pretty soon, our rat dissection, I think it's not this week, it might be 2 weeks from now. I can't remember which one comes first. You'd think I would because I wrote the book, but I know we have digestion. I think we have urinary, then we do the rat dissection, but I might have those flip-flopped. But there is all this connective tissue down in the gut, and it's called the peritoneum. and it is it's this, most of my students think, kind of ooky looking substance in there. Some of the peritoneal coverings are double layered, but they all have that whole visceral arrangement and then a parietal arrangement, and they're the serous membranes that are occurring down in there. And the peritoneal cavity is anything located between the two peritoneums, the visceral layer and the parietal layer. And without your peritoneum, you would have real problems as those organs move around as food goes through. And some of these peritoneal components are going to actually anchor vessels and that kind of thing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Those are called mesenteries. Mesenteries are these double layers of peritoneum, and these are the ones that are really important for holding things in place. They hold your vessels in place, your veins and your arteries, your lymphatics, your nerves, and some of them actually store fat as well. What else did I want to say that I've learned about mesenteries lately? I had a friend that had surgery to repair some hernias, and they put mesh inside, and she's concerned about how that exactly works out with the mesentery and whatnot, and peritoneal coverings in there. This is a picture from your textbook on this. I think this is, maybe it's not. Is this in your text, or did I find it in a different source? I can't remember. But you can see the vessels, and these are vessels, these little pink things, and this one on this side. And as you can tell, it's hard to tell whether they're veins or arteries, as it always is, unless you have a special wrap like we did that's injected, so that you can see which ones are veins and which ones are arteries. But anyhow, these are vessels that are in the peritoneum. In this particular picture, you can see the mesentery, or some of the peritoneum here, and you can see veins and arteries and whatnot that are located there. Sorry about that, I'm going the wrong way here. There we go. You'll see the term peritoneal organs or intraperitoneal if they're, like I said, in the peritoneal cavity. The only thing I really usually see, well, there are a couple things, but you see the term retroperitoneal sometimes. And anything that's retroperitoneal is located behind the cavity. The main organ I think of as being retroperitoneal is actually the kidneys. Which is handy, I guess, if you have to have a kidney biopsy or that kind of thing, because they don't have to go all the way through. Now, peritonitis is a terrible, terrible thing, because you've got so much of this tissue in there, and your abdominal cavity is so big. If the peritoneum becomes infected, that's very life-threatening, because there's so much material in there that your whole immune system will get completely overwhelmed. The most common cause of peritonitis is ruptured appendix, and this is supposedly an appendix that this arrow is pointing to in this picture, and it says RIP 8/11/09, so I think this was somebody's kind of joke, because they had to have their appendix removed then. My guess is they remove a lot of appendices unnecessary. I don't know what the percentage is, but they're not going to, if they think you have an appendicitis and it looks like you do in a film, they're going to take that thing out, because if it ruptures, it's full of bacteria from the colon. And bacteria from the colon is fine as long as it's in the colon, but if it gets into anywhere else in the body, it's bad news and causes terrible infection. You probably know that. You know, like E. coli is not something you want to eat, but E. coli is something that that occurs in our colon, which is why you don't want to drink dirty water. Yes, Shannon.
What were you saying are the peritoneal organs?
The peritoneal organs would be like the small intestine, the liver, the large intestine, except for the rectum. So most everything except for the kidneys and part of the rectal canal. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The pancreas and all that should be considered.
Right. I know on the test that I've just looked at, I've asked about peritonitis. I think I asked what's the most common cause of it. But anyhow, I do want you to know what peritonitis is, because you're going to see, unfortunately, you're going to see some of that. Now, as far as blood supply to the organs of the digestive system, we've looked at a lot of them. but in your reading, they're called the blood supply is called the splenic circulation. And arteries that you've looked at include hepatic, splenic, gastric, and the mesenteric, superior and inferior. And also, we looked a little bit at the hepatic portal circulation. And this refers to all the different digestive organs dumping their blood into this vein called the hepatic portal vein that goes up to the liver, and then the liver cleans up our blood, or cleans up, I'm sorry, not our blood, it cleans up all that, well, it is the blood, I guess, but anyhow, it's cleaning up all this material that's coming in from the digestive tract before it's dumped back into general circulation. So that is the hepatic portal circulation. As with everything, there are layers. And I know I've asked about these layers. I don't remember what, but I can't imagine I wouldn't have asked about some of these layers. There are 4 layers if you chop open, say, the small intestine. There's a layer right next to the food. That's called the mucosal layer. Then there's a submucosal layer, the muscularis externa. Those are those muscle layers I was talking about that circle the entire gut or run long ways. And then there's the serosal layer, which is the very outer layer. This is what it looks like from your textbook. And I'll try to see if so hopefully I've got my thing where it needs to be. This layer right here is the layer called mucosal layer. So the food would be in here. Any kind of hollow place in the body is a lumen. You might remember that from the lumen of the blood capillaries. And so this is where food's going to be. And then you have, notice you've got this weird little muscle layer right here, and I'll talk about that a little later on. It's kind of unusual. Then you have this layer called the submucosal layer. It's the one here that has these starfish-shaped glands in it. And then finally, you've got that double layer of muscle, the longitudinal and circular layer making up the muscularis externa. Then finally, you have a covering over the whole thing, and that's the serosal layer. And so you've got to know your 4 layers. I know I asked for these layers on the lab exam. You'll have a slide that shows these layers. It'll look just like this. And I'll ask you, what layer, which layer of the GI tract it is. I always ask that on the test. This is part of the I believe the small intestine, because you can see these finger-like projections. They're called the villi that are sticking in there. And so this part that is more pinkish is that layer called the mucosal layer. The purple layer is submucosa. This, it looks like smooth muscle is. This is the muscularis. And then finally there's your serosal covering. And this is a picture from a slide that came from your lab. Now, what does the mucosal layer do for us? It's going to secrete mucus. And do you remember what 2 tissues you learned before that secrete mucus? Epithelial tissues. It's the columnar type, whether it's simple columnar or pseudostratified. In the gut, you have the simple type. In the respiratory system, you have the pseudostratified. All right, but columnar epithelial tissue has mucus cells associated with it. We make something like 3 liters of mucus a day. Most of it, fortunately, is, I guess, not in our, I don't know if it's more in the respiratory or in the digestive system, but a lot of it's in our digestive system. And so it's going to secrete mucus. It's going to carry out absorption, and it's going to keep us from getting infectious diseases. What does that mean? That means there are going to be some components of the actual immune system that are going to be in this particular part of the system. Now, the mucosal layer is very, very complicated, and there's sublayers of it. There's that lining epithelium, which again is actual simple columnar epithelial tissue, and you can see the goblet cells in it. Then there's kind of a connective tissue called the lamina propria. And then there, you notice that weird little muscle layer. It's called the muscularis mucosae. And this is the muscle layer that's dedicated just to that layer. And it says it produces, quote, local movements. And I never have got an explanation exactly about what it does. But to the best of my knowledge, what it does is it basically kind of shimmies and knocks the food off of the villi so that it, you know what I'm talking about, kind of as it, so it's just kind of a shimmering kind of like to knock the food off here, whereas this is the one that pushes the food through. So anyhow, interesting. And in this particular picture, you can see goblet cells in columnar epithelial tissue. And you've got to have mucus because it, quote, eases the food along the track because it's nice and slick. It is part of that first line of defense. We already learned that about mucus. But the other thing it does in the digestive system is it adds a protective coating over your actual digestive organs that keeps those enzymes that are breaking down food from breaking down those cells that are making up your own digestive system. So when you're breaking down meat, whether it's steak tartare or well-cooked hamburger, you're having to use enzymes that are breaking down the same amino acid components that you're actually made of. So very important that our cells are protected. Now, in the stomach, not only does this mucosal layer have the other components I talked about, but it actually has enzyme secreting cells in there, and it has hormone secreting cells in there. So the stomach and the small intestine both release their own enzymes, so the epithelial tissue has to do that, and it has to release some hormones as well. I mentioned briefly the lamina propria. It's this connective tissue that's got some reticular components in there, so it's going to be kind of involved with defense as well. And it has lymph nodes in there that are kind of scattered about and are part of that MALT. Do you remember that stands for mucus-associated lymphatic tissue? So very important. This is just a picture I pulled from online, again showing that muscular mucosae, which, quote, provides local movements. I think of it as shimmering. And then this is where the food would be here. The submucosal layer, they describe it as being a more dense connective tissue so that it can anchor your nerves and vessels and whatnot. Then the muscularis externa, that's going to provide for segmentation and peristalsis. And then finally that protective serosal layer, which is just that visceral peritoneum. So here it is, summary of all your layers. The mucosa with its 3 subcategory layers, and then these others here. Now, at this point, I'm going to take a trip. I'm going to start with the mouth, end up at the anus, and we're going to cover various things. And so I'm going to start at the mouth, and the mouth is extremely important. You might not think about your mouth being extremely important, but taking care of your teeth, mouth, and gums is extremely important for your health for very, very many reasons. People that have bad gums are not going to be particularly healthy folks. So taking care of your teeth is just more amazingly important than you might have thought. But anyhow, the actual mouth is called the oral or buccal cavity, and the opening to it is the oral orifice. You just thought it was called a pie hole, right? But that's not really what it's called, right? It hooks up to the oropharynx in the back. You kind of probably already know what closes it. The mouth has a type of epithelial tissue that can withstand abrasion as you chew your food and eat stuff and drink acids. I mean, like Coca-Cola is acid's acidic too or something like that. So anyhow, it has stratified squamous. Stratified squamous is on your skin too, the skin at a short ways in. So stratified squamous epithelial tissue you'll find inside of your mouth, down into the pharynx a bit, and then you'll also find it coming into the body in the anal canal, because by the time feces is released, we've absorbed more water, and so it's abrasive. Interestingly, it says the gums, hard palate, and dorsum of the tongue are slightly keratinized. What's the dorsum of the tongue? Okay, I'm going to draw for you just because I can. I didn't do a very good job. I just went to the beach. What do you think this might be? It's a really badly drawn shark. Okay, and it swims along in the water, and you always worry when you see one of these sticking out of the water because that's the what kind of fin? Dorsal fin. So the dorsum of the tongue is the top of the tongue, right? And it has that keratin in there that's protective, and so that's the top of the tongue. Anything else I want to say about that? No. So I know you've already kind of tested on part of this. Here's your hard palate here. It's called hard because it's underlaid by bone. And then here's your soft palate. It terminates in the uvula, which functions to close off the nasopharynx as you swallow. This part right here is called the vestibule, or entranceway into the oral cavity. I know you've already had that too, just kind of a review. And then this flap, epiglottis, closes this off, and food goes down into the esophagus here. You might remember orbicularis oris or buccinators from your studies in 201. I've already told you what the vestibule is. The oral cavity proper is the area that's inside of your teeth and gums. The vestibule's in front, like where people keep their tobacco supposedly, or maybe little thingies that, I don't know. But anyhow, the labial frenula you can feel in the vestibule at the top and bottom. You have a superior one and you have an inferior one. You also have a lingual frenulum that holds your tongue down. Sometimes children are born and their lingual frenulum is like comes up here too far, and they actually have to clip it so that they're not, quote, tongue-tied. So you might know of people that have had that happen. These are openings to some of the external salivary glands or extrinsic salivary glands. Some people can spit out of them. That's called gleating. Have you guys ever heard of that? That's a gross boy skill usually, I have found. And the hard palate, like I said, is underlaid by bone. You might remember that the one that is located posteriorly is the palatine bone itself. And then the front portion in here is the palatine process of the maxilla. If the palatine process of the maxilla, or even I guess this portion of the maxilla doesn't close properly, then that results in, you've heard of cleft palate, right? Or cleft lip. And that has to be corrected. In our country, usually it's corrected very early in life. In some other countries, not so much. And there's an entire organization called the Smile Train that corrects those palate issues. Having palate issues is problematic because it's perceived as not particularly attractive, but there are also some issues with nutrition and being able to get proper nutrition if you can't nurse properly or eat properly because of your palate being misformed, interestingly enough. The hard palate is important too because it does give something for the tongue to kind of work against as you push the food around. Your book says it's slightly corrugated. Corrugations are those like little ridges in cardboard that you recycle. You know what I'm talking about? So corrugated means it has ridges. Not as ridged as, say, a cat's palate. I don't know if you guys have ever seen a cat or felt your cat's palate, but theirs is a real ridge so that I guess when they catch that mouse for you, they can hold on to it better. The soft palate is mainly skeletal muscle, and like I said, it's the big thing I think about is that uvula that moves up to keep food out of your nose. The tongue, again, moves the food around. It also mixes food up with saliva, and saliva is going to be very important for mouth health as well. It also is responsible for speech and initiates swallowing. Try to say a T without your tongue, and you'll realize how important it is in speech. I've already mentioned that, so I can go on. Another thing you might have noticed on your tongue are there are all these little sticky out things. And sticky out things in our body are often called papillae, like dermal papillae, or the papillary muscles of the heart. So anything that sticks out like a cone or nipple is a papilla. And so I guess people think these stick out like cones or nipples, and so these little things are papillae. And most of the papillae are called filiform. These just basically provide roughness so you can move the food around better. Then there are these that look like little mushrooms. They're stuck kind of randomly in there, and they're called fungiform. That means mushrooms. These have taste buds. And then the circumvallate ones make a little V. Those have taste buds. And then these over here have taste buds. These are called folate. And I think I've asked about taste buds too, but I don't remember what I asked about them. Maybe I asked which one doesn't have taste buds. I don't know. But anyhow, I have asked a question I know about taste buds on the test, or the last test I looked at. What did I want to tell you about this, about taste buds? Oh, have you guys ever seen those maps where that shows you this part's sour and this part's sweet and this is salty? Apparently those are complete BS. So that's what I've read lately, that they've redone that, and apparently that doesn't hold up. Now, saliva or spit is very important, and even though it's 97 to 99.5% water, most of us are completely grossed out by spit. Partially, when you do spit, you're going to spit out not only that 97 and 99% water that's making that up, but you're also going to pick up all that bacteria and whatnot that's on your teeth all the time as well. Researchers really don't like to work with spit as a general rule. Of all the substances they're working on, spit apparently is one of the worst. But anyhow, there are components of spit that have enzymes and mucus and watery stuff. It's usually slightly, well, I guess it's almost always slightly acidic, maybe always. What's in spit? Electrolytes. Remember, those are just charged particles. Digestive enzymes, salivary amylase, and something called lingual lipase. Salivary amylase is very important, believe it or not. It starts breaking down starch. And if you put a salt cracker, it's like a saltine cracker in your mouth, and you let it dissolve a little bit, in just a little bit of time, you'll start tasting sweet. Have you ever noticed that? You hadn't, maybe you could do that. And that's because the salivary amylase starts breaking that soda cracker down, the starch in it down to sugar in your mouth. And some people produce way more salivary amylase than others, interestingly enough. This thing called lingual lipase supposedly starts digesting fats, but doesn't really do us a whole lot of good as far as physiologists can tell. So it's always said, and I know this has been a test question, that one of the only real source of enzymes that break down fats for us is the pancreas. So without your pancreas, you can't digest fats at all. Fat digestion is weird, though. It requires also something called bile from the stomach. From the liver. So I completely missed a boat on that, from the liver. So without your liver producing bile and your pancreas producing lipases that make a difference, you couldn't break down fats. All right. So there are proteins in there, including mucin, lysosomes, defensin. One of the immunoglobulins called immunoglobulin A. Do you remember that they started, there was MAGE, there were different categories, and so there's one in there. It's an extremely important one because it keeps the bacteria from sticking so bad to surfaces in your mouth, including your teeth. And then there's a little bit of metabolic waste in there. All right, I think I am officially out of time, and I'll have to decide whether I want to talk a little bit more before I continue. I kind of think I would like to get through teeth before we start lab today. And so I will give you guys a little break, and I'll see you in 15 minutes, and we'll at least do lab. We might do a little bit of lecture. I will let you know. Destiny, you want to go ahead and look at your test, or you want to wait till after lab? Wait till after lab? Okay.